So you've probably had this happen before. You're in the middle of shooting a video, whether it's an interview or just some B-roll, and everything's going great until your camera's focus just starts going haywire. It decides it's going to ruin your entire video, and it's just going to go on a little adventure. The focus starts to pulse back and forth. It's hunting, it's searching for focus, but it just can't seem to find it. And usually this happens at the worst possible time, on the highest stakes video project of your entire life. Your camera's focus goes crazy. And ultimately you get back to the edit in post-production and you find out that that little adventure that your focus went on, it makes the shot completely unusable. Or maybe you've had the opposite problem. You're shooting in manual focus and you look at your image on your LCD screen and you think, oh, everything's perfectly in focus. Tack sharp, no problem. But then you get into post-production and then you zoom in, you pixel peep, and then you realize it's actually completely out of focus. I would be lying if I said that this has not happened to me at least 10 to 20 times. Both sides of the spectrum that we just explained are focusing problems. They ultimately stem from you not understanding when to use manual focus and when to use autofocus. So that's exactly what we're going to cover in today's video. When to use manual focus and when to use autofocus. So let's start really simple. The difference between manual focus and autofocus comes down to one thing. And that one thing is who exactly is controlling where the lens on your camera is focusing. With autofocus, your camera is making that decision for you. With manual focus, you are making that decision manually. Now, on most cameras, you'll see a little switch that says AF/MF. This stands for autofocus/manual focus. And this switch essentially controls what focus mode your camera's in. Manual focus or autofocus. Now here's really the important thing to understand. Both autofocus and manual focus have their place on a professional set. People over the last 10 to 20 years have tended to demonize autofocus because of a myriad of reasons. And they would say, oh, manual focus is just more professional, which I would agree, yes, and it's not always the answer and the right tool for the job, depending on the context of the shoot that you're on. So it's all nuanced. There's been this idea in filmmaking for many, many years that manual focus is for the professionals and autofocus is an amateur feature. However, I do not subscribe to this way of thinking. To me, it's not that black and white. Now, what that way of thinking stems from is the fact that autofocus has really only gotten really, really good in the past 5 to 10 years. So good, in fact, that it's actually usable on a professional set in many different applications. For the majority of the time that filmmaking has been a thing, autofocus hasn't even existed, let alone in a usable state. So that's essentially why that stigma has been created and still prevails today. But the stigma is starting to kind of regress and starting to kind of go away, which I really, really appreciate. So the answer to which one is better is not black and white. It is just simply understanding which one to use in which scenario that will suit you the best for the job that you're trying to do. Because ultimately, autofocus and manual focus are exactly the same thing in that they're just a tool. So treat them accordingly. So for focus, here's a general rule I like to follow. If I have control over my environment, similar to this scene, and my subject is stationary, like I am right now, I'll use manual focus, like I'm doing right now. And vice versa, if I have a moving subject and I don't have real control over my environment, I'll use autofocus because for that situation, it just makes more sense. So let me break that down a little bit for you. Manual focus is almost 90% of the time my choice for controlled shoots, like interviews, talking heads, product shots, anything in the studio that is in a very, very controlled environment. In those moments, I want complete control. And I have the ability to choose to have complete control with manual focus. So in those scenarios, I'll use manual focus. Now, even that is not 100%. Sometimes in those scenarios, I'll use autofocus too. In fact, there will be seasons of shooting where I'll use autofocus more in those scenarios. It just kind of depends on exactly what I'm doing in the context of the shoot that I'm on. So like I said earlier, it's not black and white, and I don't think it'll ever be black and white. And anybody who says it's black and white Like, oh, manual focus is better because XYZ. Oh, autofocus is better because XYZ. Or manual focus is superior. They're taking an opinion that doesn't really have good logic. So I'd be aware of those people, and I would challenge them on their beliefs at the very least. But yeah, it's not black and white. So now, like manual focus is better in some instances, like I just explained, autofocus is better in some instances as well. Autofocus, in my opinion, is better in uncontrolled environments. Like, let's say you're shooting a wedding film and the bride and the groom have just kissed and they're walking down the aisle, and you have two angles going and you got a lot going through your mind, and you need to nail this shot. So what I do is I make sure my focus point is set in the center, and I have a camera that has autofocus that is extraordinarily reliable. That's also something you need to consider. If the hardware for an autofocus system in your camera is actually reliable, very, very important. I would use autofocus in this scenario because I know that it's going to be difficult for me in a very fast-paced environment to be able to manual focus fast enough to be able to reliably get focus on the bride and groom as they're walking towards me. So that's a scenario where I almost 100% of the time exclusively use autofocus, because ultimately I know that in that scenario, autofocus is going to be far more reliable than my fingers on the lens, controlling the focus myself. Here's an exercise you can try at home to kind of try and build your instincts when it comes to manual focus and autofocus, and kind of understanding which scenarios need which tool. Set your camera up on a tripod, put something in front of your camera about 3-4 feet away, maybe on a table, and open your aperture as wide as it can go, like f1.2 or f2.8, as wide as your aperture can go, so you can get a nice shallow depth of field. After you've done this, turn your camera into autofocus mode and make sure the little box on your camera is on that object. Once you have that box on the object, look to see if the focus is pulling in and out and it's going in and out of focus. And then try waving your hand in between your camera lens and the object, and pull it out, put it back in, and then wave it, keep waving it in front and in and out of the field of view from your object. Whenever you do this, does the camera stay locked on to the object, or is it jumping to your hand? Kind of watch the screen as you move your hand in and out of frame to see what's going on the screen and with the focus. Now I want you to do exactly the same thing, but turn your camera into manual focus mode. Use the focus ring to focus on the object that's 3 or 4 feet away from your camera, and do exactly the same thing. Wave your hand in front of the lens, block your camera's view of the object, and notice the camera's not going to be pulsing back and forth like it did previously with autofocus turned on. That's because you're in manual focus, and manual focus doesn't necessarily react to anything in front of the lens that's changing where the focus should be if you were in autofocus mode. Now, pick up your camera off the tripod, leave it in manual focus mode, and as you're walking to and from, getting closer and further away from the object that you set on the table, and try to focus manually on that object as you're going forward and backward, as you're walking forward and backward. You'll notice that it's extraordinarily difficult to keep focus on that object. So in this scenario, it would make more sense to use autofocus. So now, switch your camera into autofocus, and you'll find that as you're approaching the object and walking away from the object, pointing your camera at the object, and as long as the box is on the object and you're set in the right autofocus mode, as you go forward and backward, you'll notice that the object is staying in focus almost completely. Now, depending on what kind of camera system you have, you'll see that it's, maybe not in focus all the time, but 90% of the time, most autofocus systems on modern day cameras are really, really, really good. And ultimately, in this scenario, it would be way better to use autofocus rather than manual focus. Unless, of course, you had a person who is a focus puller. That means it's somebody's specific job on set to use an off-camera monitor and wireless video transmission system with a focus motor in their hands to actually pull focus remotely. But we can talk about that in later videos. That's a little bit more advanced. Here's how I would handle focus on a real-world set. So I arrive at the shoot location, I set up all my lights and my camera, and I have my angle all prepared. Client walks in, shake hands.
Hey, how you doing? Blah, blah, blah.
They sit down for the interview, and my cameras are already set up, and I want to make sure to get focus on the interviewee as soon as they sit down so we can get rolling. So in a scenario like this, I would go ahead and pick manual focus, because manual focus, no matter what goes in front of the camera, nothing's going to make the focus jump because it's in manual focus. And ultimately, the interviewee, they're going to be sitting there for the entirety of the interview motionless. Now, unless I realize that they're not going to be motionless and they're, a really expressive talker, and then I would probably acknowledge that and switch one of the cameras or both of the cameras to autofocus mode. And I would put it in a setting that I know would be conducive to how they're moving. And me explaining this right now, I'm realizing just how nuanced this all is. And I know I've said that already, but as I explain myself through this, it's not black and white. Like I've said, it's yes and this. It's always a yes and conversation. It's not an if. It's not an or conversation. It's either this or this. It's this and this. They're both, like I said, they're both tools, and ultimately you just have to understand how to use the tools that you've been given. And autofocus and manual focus, they're just different kinds of tools. It's like a mallet and a regular hammer. You hit things with both of them, but they're meant for different purposes, and they get two different outcomes depending on the scenario that you use them in. So treat manual focus and autofocus like that. Here's a little pro tip before we wrap up the video. When you're using autofocus, always check your autofocus settings on your camera. Depending on the camera that you have, they'll have different adjustments for the autofocus system. How fast it locks onto something, how sticky it is when it locks onto something. So if something goes in front of the frame really quick, it's not going to jump. But if it stays in front of there for too long, it'll jump to whatever's in front of it. So always keep in mind your autofocus system. If you're using autofocus for a shoot, usually most modern cameras have adjustments that can be made to the autofocus system itself on how sticky and how responsive the autofocus system is. So always keep that in mind whenever you're going into a shoot, and keep that in the back of your head for different scenarios. So here are a couple additional notes that you should keep in mind. The question isn't really, is autofocus good or bad, or is manual focus good or bad? The real question that you should be asking yourself is, okay, what am I shooting, and which would be the better tool for the job? Ultimately, if you're in a situation where you want the most amount of control, you should do manual focus. And in addition to that, if you're in a situation where you know that the autofocus is going to be more reliable than you and what you can keep up with your moving subject, go with autofocus. Focus is not just a technical setting. It's a tool to be able to tell a story. What you choose to put in focus and what you choose to put out of focus is exactly what's going to dictate where the viewer looks. And it's going to show them exactly what's the most important thing that they should be looking at in the scene for the story. So, like every other setting or concept that we've talked about on this channel, focus is just one piece of the puzzle, and it should be treated like that. Just one piece of the puzzle. It's important, but it's just one piece. And like I said, it's a tool. Learn how to use the tool. It's not a tool that you're going to use every single time. You're not going to use manual focus every single time. You're not going to use autofocus every single time. But it's a tool. That's all it is. Learn how to use it, and learn how to use it properly, and learn when not to use it. Well, that is a comprehensive overview of manual focus and autofocus and when to use each of them in their respective scenarios. My name is Hayden Cornfloss, and I am an in-house video producer for an 8-figure national brand here in the USA. And this channel exists to teach you exactly how to do what I do, which is create beautiful, engaging videos and ultimately build yourself a career in the video production world. If any of that interests you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, as we release weekly videos talking about anything from technical, tangible concepts in the video production world all the way to theoretical concepts like color grading or lighting theory. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you in the next one.